2026 is shaping up to be one hell of a year for cinematic anniversaries, with a whole slew of movies that were formative for me growing up celebrating major milestone birthdays. Casino Royale turns 20 in November. I can't even wrap my head around that. That's fucking nuts. Mission Impossible is 30. JFK is 35 in December, just to name a few. Where the fuck does the time go? But of all the noteworthy anniversaries this year, the film I haven't been able to get out of my head for the past month or so isn't even hitting a big round number, although it did get a flashy 4K remaster and an IMAX re-release to boot. That film is, of course, Speed Racer, a movie that needs very little introduction. A visionary work that genuinely pushed the limits of maximalist filmmaking in ways that, had it come out in the 2020s, probably would have garnered a metric ton of praise. But instead, it was released in 2008, a time when gritty realism was the aesthetic du jour, particularly when adapting stories from less vaunted mediums such as comics, video games, and cartoons. What I'm trying to say is, it makes perfect sense that this film bombed the way it did at the time. I vividly remember watching trailers for it as a kid and being simultaneously captivated, intrigued, and put off by the uncanny effects and sheer visual overload in every frame. Despite the fact that its directors were medium redefining auteurs with a once-in-a-generation masterpiece under their belts, Speed Racer just looked like a bit too much. Then again, I was 13 years old, so yeah, of course I thought that. Everything's lame when you're 13. It wasn't until high school that my curiosity finally won out and I actually sat down to watch it, only to be completely transfixed. I may not have watched Speed Racer right away, but as soon as I did, I got it. Well, maybe not got it in the way that I get it now, but I had an exhilarating otherworldly time with the movie for all the reasons it scared me off initially. I mean, it was a film that as soon as I watched, I was like, I gotta get some of my friends to watch this. This is a fantastic movie. And yet, they didn't get it. They didn't get the experience that I had gone through, and they were like, this is stupid. It's too much. It's just bad. And you know, maybe it made me want to go to bat for the movie more than I already was at that age, because like, hey guys, come on, this is interesting stuff here. Speed Racer is a weird, radical film, one that can be hard to sell someone on if they're wary of the gonzo presentation like I was. But if you can get past that reflexive hesitation, what you'll be treated to is a deceptively inviting viewing experience, one that eases you into the Wachowskis' unique mode of storytelling and effortlessly places you into the subjective perspective of its boundlessly creative, if not slightly ADHD, protagonist. In a way, watching Speed Racer is almost like learning a new language. At first, your brain resists this new, confusing form of communication because the syntax and grammar are contrary to what you're accustomed to. But once you learn to set aside your preconceptions and surrender to what it is you're being presented with, the neurons connect and everything suddenly clicks. Speed Racer is patently ridiculous, but that absurdity in no way reflects a lack of seriousness on the part of the filmmakers. Far from it. They simply realized that depicting emotional and philosophical reality was not predicated on depicting physical reality, and so they opted for a more sensory approach, abandoning the limits of reality to better convey these fundamental truths. Which isn't to dog on gritty, realistic adaptations. I mean, if you're subscribed to this channel, you kind of know that I love that kind of film. You'll know that Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight movies, the pinnacle of late 2000s gritty realism, are three of my favorite films of all time. But, well, I mean, have you ever watched the Speed Racer anime? Some stories are just better off not even trying to be grounded. And so the Wachowskis, hot off the Matrix, found a way, as they always do, to be nonconformists. With the help of cutting-edge visual effects and an army of passionate technicians, they bucked the trends of the day and embraced the off-kilter spirit and energy of the source material, completely shattering the conventions of traditional tentpole filmmaking in the process. If The Matrix was the Wachowskis writing an original story that asked the audience to question the nature of their reality, Speed Racer is the same contrarian impulse tuned onto the process of adaptation itself. A film that goes a step beyond simply telling its audience that the world they know isn't real. It proves it by rebuilding the visual language of cinema right before their eyes. Speed Racer is unconcerned with bending its source material to fit the laws of reality the way so many adaptations do. Instead, it endeavors to bend the laws of reality to fit its source material. In doing so, the Wachowskis created a work that challenged its medium almost as much as it challenged the corporate forces that willed it into existence in the first place. An anti-capitalist, pro-artist story about using the vehicle of IP to exercise the full extent of your creativity, made by artists using a beloved IP to exercise the full extent of their own creativity, even if it meant rejecting the trends that might have made the film successful in the marketplace. The Wachowskis evidently understood where our over-reliance on existing franchises was headed, and decided to use their own foray into franchise filmmaking to expose the rot at the heart of it all. This is exactly why, at a time where tastes have finally changed and it's now in vogue to hew as close as possible to a story's source material, unabashedly embracing the bright colors and abstract visuals so prevalent in other mediums, Speed Racer has taken on a second life. Modern audiences crave an artist's personal stamp in franchise films. It's why Matt Reeves' The Batman, James Gunn's Superman, Greta Gerwig's Barbie, and the Spider-Verse films have all struck such a massive chord with people. They're unafraid of embracing the very things that made people fall in love with these characters and universes in the first place, but never at the expense of the artist's voice. Speed Racer was kind of ahead of the curve in this regard, managing to capture what fans of the anime actually liked about Speed Racer while never feeling subservient to the source material. A film made for fans of the original series, not because the studio was intent on pandering to them, but because the filmmakers were themselves fans of what they're adapting and wanted to honor what they love about the source material while still putting their own unique spin on it, using it as a vehicle to interrogate ideas and themes that were deeply personal to them as artists. So, as Speed Racer accelerates towards turning 18 this year, I think it's high time we took a look under the hood and figured out once and for all why a movie that nobody seemed to care for back in 2008 has gone on to become something of a modern classic. To really appreciate what the Wachowskis did with Speed Racer, you have to understand what people actually disliked about it in 2008, because despite how it's sometimes recounted, the film didn't bomb because audiences weren't ready for a Wachowski family movie. It bombed because critics and the small contingent of people who went out and actually saw it in theaters felt it was an assault on the senses. To hear them tell it, the visual style, which stacked comic panel overlays, slid backgrounds across shots like speed lines, and leaned harder into pure saturation than just about anything else at the multiplex, was downright silly, falling into the same uncanny valley as Robert Rodriguez's Spy Kids films, or to a lesser extent, Ang Lee's Hulk. Add to that a garish color palette and less than photorealistic visual effects that felt incongruent with the human actors they surrounded, and most people wrote the thing off as a misfire. That willingness to dismiss what were deliberate creative decisions as errors makes a whole lot more sense when you remember where the Wachowskis were in their careers. Just 5 years earlier, in 2003, The Matrix Reloaded and The Matrix Revolutions hit theaters 6 months apart, and both were met with less than favorable reactions. Reloaded was divisive at best, while Revolutions was almost universally derided, and by 2008, the consensus was that the Wachowskis had peaked in 1999 and spent the back half of the Matrix trilogy chasing increasingly opaque philosophical rabbit holes into the ground. A lot of the goodwill they had coming out of the first Matrix had been eaten up by the sequels. The first film changed cinema, sure, but people had started to wonder whether it had been a fluke. The Wachowskis were firmly in the Shyamalan zone, and with that baggage in mind, the unwillingness to meet Speed Racer on its own terms actually tracks pretty neatly. If you were on board with where the Wachowskis were going in Reloaded and Revolutions, the overt messaging, the conspiratorial thinking, the willingness to let style override comfort, then you were already on Speed Racer's wavelength. If you weren't, which was most people, quite frankly, then Speed Racer felt like another victim of the same creative impulses that had supposedly wrecked the Matrix sequels, just with, significantly more juvenile sensibilities. But, like the vibrant visuals and stylized editing, these juvenile sensibilities weren't a miscalculation on the part of the Wachowskis. They didn't accidentally make a childish movie. They were intentionally making a movie for kids, but not for the usual reasons a filmmaker might decide to try their hand at making a family film. Lana Wachowski has talked in interviews about how the impetus for Speed Racer came out of a frustration with the visual sameness of mainstream cinema. Being visually thinking people, the Wachowskis go to galleries and museums constantly, and one thing that bugged them about film as an art form was the fact that one could walk through a museum and encounter paintings that look and feel completely unlike the paintings featured in the room before, whereas at the multiplex, everything looks essentially the same. As far as the Wachowskis were concerned, cinema, for all its formal possibilities, had settled into an extremely narrow aesthetic straitjacket, one imposed by the limits of physical reality as captured on film. So, while developing Speed Racer, they started talking about cubism, about what it would look like to make a cubist film. And the answer they kept arriving at was that you simply couldn't make a cubist film, at least not for adults. In their experience, adults reject formal change too violently, not unlike the way audiences who first saw Picasso's Guernica wanted to chase him out of town with pitchforks. They argued every generation experiences a kind of aesthetic death. That is, the moment when the conventions they grew up with stop being expanded and start getting protected. And once you've crossed that line, anything that genuinely assaults your aesthetic sensibilities feels like a personal attack. But kids haven't crossed that line yet. Kids are okay with wild aesthetic deviations. Kids will watch a sequence built like a run-on sentence and not even notice that it's strange, because they don't yet have a firm enough grasp of the narrative and filmic conventions that such a sequence violates. So, if you wanted to make a film that twists, inverts, or flat out ignores the grammar of cinema, your best bets at finding an audience that will resonate with your work is to make it for kids. Not because kids aren't a discerning audience, but rather because kids aren't a close-minded audience. Kids will, often without even thinking about it, judge a creative decision on its face value merits, not on whether it conforms with the pre-established rules and norms of the medium. Speed Racer being a family film isn't a compromise or a coincidence, it's kind of essential for the kind of art they wanted to create at that point in time. However, the fact that Speed Racer wound up being the project that put this ethos into practice was pure happenstance. Sure, the Wachowskis had nostalgic memories of watching the show and falling in love with its anachronisms.
There was such an infatuation with the cartoon in our child's mind.
But this interest in Speed Racer was ultimately secondary to their desire to experiment with the visual language of cinema. In fact, the Speed Racer film had been kicking around Warner Brothers since the mid-90s, well before anyone was even thinking about the Wachowskis as filmmakers. At various points, Johnny Depp had been attached to play Speed, Henry Rollins had been circling Racer X, and multiple writers and directors had taken swings at the script. By the time the Wachowskis came on in 2006, the property was a long dormant development looking for a filmmaker brave enough or persistent enough to actually make it. From the very first sequence of the movie, the Wachowskis draw a hard line between their approach and every other major studio adaptation of the era. We open on young Speed in grade school, bored out of his mind, staring down at a Scantron test he's clearly not going to pass. As he starts to daydream, the classroom dissolves around him. His desk becomes a cockpit. His teacher's voice melts into the roar of engines. He's imagining himself on the track, racing like his brother Rex, tearing through colors and flanked by speed lines in the shape of the thing he loves most. The Wachowskis fold this imagination and his memories of his brother Rex into the same sequence so that Speed's daydream about being a racer is inseparable from his memory of watching his brother be one. This opening is a microcosm of the entire movie. On the most practical level, it's an onboarding sequence, the Wachowskis easing you into the visual grammar they're going to employ for the rest of the film. If you can get on board with the sliding backgrounds and layered panel transitions in a grade school classroom, you'll pretty much be on board for a racing sequence that does the same thing at 10 times the scale. On another level, it's establishing the strength of Speed's lifelong passion. Racing isn't simply a career for Speed, it's his obsession. It's the obsession. A dream sparked during his formative years on the racetrack with his brother, and so deeply rooted in that fraternal relationship that his pursuit of racing becomes an extension of his desire to become like his brother.
This is the test he turned in last week.
This dynamic is ultimately the thematic engine of the film, the idea around which everything else in the story revolves. Speed's love of racing is inseparable from his love of Rex. They're the same thing sprouted from the same seed, ingrained so deeply within him that Speed can't even fill out a Scantron without subconsciously filling in his brother's racing chant. The rest of the movie is about disentangling those two seemingly inseparable parts of himself. How does Speed honor where his passion from racing came from, honor the man who inspired it, without becoming a monument to him? Why does he race? Speed has to discover why he loves racing and what it means to him, separate from the things that inspired him to pursue it in the first place. In essence, Speed Racer is a coming-of-age story, one that interrogates Speed's passion and tests his resolve, forcing him to confront the unpleasant realities of the life he romanticized for so many years. As Rex tells him later in the film,
"You don't climb into a T-180 to be a driver. You do it because you're driven."
But long before Rex utters these words, that very sentiment has already been expressed visually in the opening minutes of the movie. However, as radical as the Wachowskis' form-shattering approach to the visual storytelling is, it's merely one aspect of what makes Speed Racer such an engrossing experience. For me, Speed Racer's real charm is found in its story. In classic Wachowski fashion, it isn't exactly subtle with its themes. It's blunter than a butter knife, but it would be a mistake to misconstrue its directness for a lack of nuance. Yes, Speed Racer wears its ideas on its sleeve, but as with the Matrix trilogy before it, those ideas are layered through every aspect of the story with incredible care. Probably the best example of this is the film's criticism of capitalism. If you somehow missed it, Speed Racer has a bone to pick with unfettered capitalism, so much so that the central conflict of the film effectively boils down to a small group of ultra-wealthy elites hollowing out the very thing they got rich selling in their ceaseless pursuit of even higher profits. But while I'd posit the film portrays this self-destructive greed about as well well as any other film on that matter, its exploration of this theme doesn't end at a mere depiction of it. After all, this is the Wachowskis we're talking about here. Two filmmakers who made a name for themselves encouraging audiences to question the line between reality and fiction. So, in characteristically meta fashion, Speed Racer turns its lens inward, not just depicting capitalism's corrosive influence on society and culture, but interrogating its own role in that corrosion as a piece of mass-market blockbuster entertainment. What on the surface plays like a pretty straightforward anti-capitalist story is underpinned by a meta-narrative that calls into question the very system that produced it. Although never made explicit, the film's broad exploration of the rampant consumerism endemic to motorsports maps pretty cleanly onto the highly commercialized nature of the film industry, more specifically, the Hollywood studio system. And once those two lines are connected, it becomes pretty undeniable why this film's condemnation of capitalism is as strong as it is. Because Speed Racer isn't really about motorsports. It's about the struggle for artistic freedom within the confines of a hyper-capitalist world. Whether that's the freedom to race simply for the love of the sport, or make big, ambitious films without succumbing to the fickle, creatively bankrupt whims of capital. The reason the Wachowskis were so drawn to this material in particular is because they understand Speed on a fundamental level. Like him, they know how difficult it is to maintain a passion for your craft when pursuing it professionally means operating within an industry that habitually devalues craftsmanship and actively resists individual expression, lest it challenge the moneyed interests bankrolling the entire operation. So when Speed questions what racing means to him and whether he can continue knowing the true nature of the game, his concerns are really just an echo of the Wachowskis' own concerns that it may not be able to make art without compromise within a capitalist system. Now, there's something to be said for the gamble the Wachowskis make on hinging the story on the optimistic conclusion that, yes, it is possible to make art within the studio system to overcome the compromising influences of corporate America and make an unflinching and legitimately subversive artistic statement and have it be a commercial success. After all, that's what Speed does. Not only does he resist the corrupting influence of Royalton and the broken establishment he embodies, he defeats them, exposing their crimes to the world while winning the race on his own terms, effectively affirming his commitment to racing with honor and integrity. Speed's victory is emblematic of the Wachowskis' broad optimism that love and passion will always overcome greed and cynicism. There's just, one small problem. The movie bombed, which in a sense feels like a refutation of that optimism. A harsh reminder that, in reality, the righteous don't always win the day. In retrospect, there's a certain irony to Speed Racer's optimism. The film about resisting the machine was itself crushed by that machine, but in a way that almost makes that optimism feel all the more necessary, a glimmer of hope in the ever-darkening abyss. The Wachowskis knew the odds going in. They knew making the film their way was never guaranteed to be a hit, that successfully realizing their artistic vision within a rigged system was a pipe dream, but they chose to tell a story that affirms hope and optimism anyway. A story in which Royalton and the machine he represents are overcome, and Speed is free to redefine what winning looks like. This defiant optimism in the face of unrelenting cynicism is laid out most explicitly in the sequence in Royalton's office, which honestly might be my favorite scene in the entire film, or well, it's one of them. Royalton, oh my god, he's such a son of a bitch. I love it. Speed, fresh off a career-making race that's put him on the cover of every magazine in the country, is summoned to the palatial headquarters of Royalton Industries, where CEO EP Arnold Royalton rolls out the red carpet for him. He shows Speed the cars, he shows Speed the gear, he shows him the life, everything he's ever wanted, everything he's ever imagined. He's got a whole pitch ready, and he's ready to sell it. He's flattering, funny, magnanimous, and for a moment, you can see Speed starting to get swept up in it. But Speed also recognizes that in taking on all of this and being a part of all of this, he loses the intimacy that he has with his family, the handcrafted approach. Royalton can talk all he wants about giving Speed a personal experience, about creating an environment where his family can keep doing the things that they've always done, basically a corporation coming in and taking ownership of a boutique store but trying to maintain that boutique flair. It doesn't work. And Speed recognizes this, and while he loves everything that Royalton's throwing at him superficially, Speed politely declines the offer. And then, oh boy, then Royalton drops the mask. What follows is essentially Speed's moment of disillusionment served up as an all-time great monologue from Roger Allum. I mean, the guy is just so endlessly magnetic on screen, so deliciously sinister. I love this performance. With the slightly amused tone of a grown-up explaining Santa Claus to a child, Royalton walks Speed through the entire history of professional racing. He tells him that the sport isn't real, that it hasn't been real in decades, that corporate interests have actually determined the outcome of every significant race, using the sports as a lever to manipulate stock prices, crush smaller competitors, and concentrate wealth at the top. Every driver Speed has ever revered was in reality either a pawn, a puppet, or a cautionary tale. The races themselves are theater, the proverbial circuses in bread and circuses, a distraction designed to obscure something truly heinous. The only question that matters is whether you want to be on the side of capital or on the side of the pacified masses. Naturally, Speed is horrified, and Royalton, seeing the horror in his face, decides to twist the knife further. Because what else is a man whose entire life is built on the misery of others to do? He tells Speed that if he doesn't play ball, he won't just fail, he'll be destroyed. His family will be ruined, his career will end before it begins, and the rigged races will continue without him exactly as they have for a century, indifferent to his attempt to stand on his morals. What makes this exchange hit so hard is that Royalton isn't lying. It's really the crux of the entire dynamic. The Wachowskis don't give themselves the easy out for making Royalton a liar. The system really is rigged. The sport really is a sham. The question isn't whether he's telling the truth. The question is, what do you do with that information once you have it? Royalton is the machine. He's Hollywood. He's Warner Brothers. He's every executive who's ever told a talented filmmaker that their vision is cute, but it's time to grow up and make something that actually sells tickets. And Speed is the Wachowskis themselves. Like I said, none of this is subtle. It isn't supposed to be. After all, this scene is the thesis of the film, and the Wachowskis make sure you can't miss it. Speed, God bless him, refuses the offer, and the rest of the film is framed as a response to this conversation about what that refusal to bend the knee will cost. You see it first and most painfully in Rex Racer. Speed's older brother is his hero and the reason he took up driving in the first place. But unbeknownst to Speed, he too was a victim of the system Royalton describes. Years before the events of the film, Rex was caught up in a cheating scandal that, as we eventually learned, was completely manufactured by the corporate interests running the sport. As a result, he was blackballed, erased, labeled a bad apple by the very system that weeds out the good apples as a condition of participation. And then, in the Casa Cristo 5000, he died in a horrific crash trying to clear his name. Rex isn't just a tragedy in Speed's backstory. He's an omen of the tragedy that may yet befall him. Rex is what happens to those who realize too late that there's no victory in compliance. He's proof positive that the only way to win against the machine is to not play. Pops, Speed's father, understands this in his bones. He's an independent engineer who designs his own cars in his own garage and who has, his whole career, refused to let a sponsor logo on one of his vehicles. His whole workshop is a monument to doing it yourself. The Mach 5, Speed's iconic car, is the passion project of a single artistic vision. When Royalton sends his corporate muscle to ruin the Racer family business later in the film, Pop's response is to literally throw hands. I mean, it's played as a comedic beat, sure, but there's a palpable rage in the way John Goodman plays it. Pops has been in this fight long enough to know exactly what that offer on the table actually is, and is therefore wise enough to treat it with the contempt it deserves. And then there's Casa Cristo, the buck-wild cross-country rally race that dominates the middle chunk of the film. Casa Cristo is Speed Racer at its most literal, a deathmatch masquerading as motorsport, where the rules don't apply and every other driver is a corporate-sponsored assassin brandishing lethal weapons. It's a microcosm of the entire blood-soaked industry. Speed isn't just trying to win Casa Cristo, he's trying to fucking survive it. And survive it he does, not because the system let him. He wins because he outdoes the system at its own game, aided by Racer X, his brother Rex in disguise, the ghost of the system's last casualty there to ensure his little brother doesn't suffer the same tragic fate he did. Speed beats them clean and on his own terms. This is, in the most literal sense imaginable, what the Wachowskis were trying to do when they made Speed Racer. Speed Racer is a film that could only exist because the Wachowskis had the clout to get a studio to greenlight it. It's also a film that exists in total opposition to everything said studio wanted it to be. Okay, so Speed Racer's personal. Great, we all get that. It's a rage against the machine kind of story. But so far I've only outlined the ways in which the film speaks to the plight of artists trying to realize their creative vision under the capitalistic pressures of the studio system. Is that really the extent to which the film is personal to the Wachowskis? No, not even close. But to dig into why, we need to talk a bit more about Rex. If Speed Racer is a testament to the Wachowskis' defiant artistry, then it stands to reason it also serves as a testament to who the Wachowskis are as people. And no aspect of Speed Racer feels more informed by who the Wachowskis are at the cores of their beings than the story of Rex Racer. Although the Wachowskis' filmography is awash with allusions to the sisters' lived experiences as trans women, I feel pretty confident, and I don't think I'm alone in this, in saying that the Rex Racer X storyline is probably the most overt trans allegory they've ever put to screen, which is no small feat considering these are the same women who built an entire franchise around the existential dread that comes from realizing your mind mind and body are untethered from one another, and the life the world has forced you to live is actually an illusion deliberately designed to prevent you from living authentically in your body. But unlike the allegory for gender dysphoria at the hearts of those films, the transness of Rex's story is somehow even more direct. Where The Matrix's allegory is abstract, Rex's arc in Speed Racer is only 1 or 2 degrees removed from just being a literal trans story. As critic Kyle Keegan put it in his book Lana and Lily Wachowski Sensing Transgender, Rex/Racer X is symbolically transsexual. And this makes a lot of sense when you consider where Lana and Lily were in life when developing Speed Racer. As anyone over the age of 25 with a functioning memory can tell you, Lily and Lana's gender identities were heavily speculated on well before either of them came out publicly. As the first of the sisters to begin transitioning, Lana faced particularly intense scrutiny, with rumors of her desire to transition popping up in blogs and tabloid articles as far back as the development of the Matrix sequels. However, it wasn't until the mid-2000s that the mainstream press began contributing to the rumor mill, putting Lana's gender identity on the radar of the wider public. In early 2006, about 9 months before Lana and her sister began developing Speed Racer, Rolling Stone's Pete Wilkinson published The Mystery of Larry Wachowski, an invasive and salacious expose that dug into Lana's private life, her relationships, her changing gender presentation, and her, at the time still private, gender identity, all but outing the up-and-coming filmmaker without her consent. I can't speak for Lana, but I have to imagine the entire situation was incredibly confronting, both emotionally and mentally. Although the reporting was unsubstantiated and therefore wouldn't be treated as fact until it was officially confirmed by Lana herself, the media had effectively robbed her of the ability to introduce a more authentic version of self to the world on her own terms and in her own voice. Whether she confirmed or denied the claims, her coming out would henceforth be seen as a response. And when you watch Speed Racer, it's hard not to notice all the ways that pain, whether consciously or not, informs the story, particularly as it relates to Rex. When Rex starts his racing career, he's working in his father's garage, doing the thing he loves on his own terms, surrounded by his family. But as time goes on, the pressures of the system start to wear on him. At first, he decides to play the game. He drives for the corporate sponsors and becomes the version of himself that the world wants him to be. But in doing so, he gradually turns into someone he no longer recognizes. By the time he reaches Casa Cristo, the version of Rex his family loved is already gone, replaced by a public persona Rex didn't choose and can no longer escape. So Rex does the only thing he can to reclaim himself. He destroys the person he's become by staging his own death and undergoing extensive plastic surgery in order to assume a new identity, one of his own choosing, Racer X. And in forging this new identity, Rex becomes the racer he originally dreamed of being. Rex is finally able to live life on his own terms. I mean, come the fuck on, guys. The only thing that makes this a trans allegory and not a literal trans story is the fact that Rex doesn't receive gender-affirming care. Although getting plastic surgery to look like Matthew Fox is pretty fucking close. There's a fantastic moment late in the film where Speed confronts Racer X and insists that he's his brother Rex, only for Racer X to remove his helmet and reveal that no, he isn't. Not only is it a fantastic subversion of the way these kinds of dramatic confrontations typically play out, but it effortlessly communicates the totality of Rex's arc in almost no words. The truth is, Rex isn't being completely untruthful when he says he isn't Speed's deceased brother, because he isn't, at least not in spirits. Racer X is who Rex always was deep down, so when he takes off the mask, the fact that the face underneath doesn't resemble the brother he lost is both literally true thanks to plastic surgery and symbolically true, because the version of his brother he expected to see is gone. And that's what makes the Rex storyline so fucking poignant. It's the revolution of the self that is transitioning made manifest in a pulp action hero who saves the world from those who would design to tell others how to live their lives. And what makes it so much more compelling is that the Wachowskis don't soft pedal what this crusade costs Rex. If you don't know the twist going in, you may not even pick up on them on a first viewing, but the film is rife with quietly devastating moments of Rex as Racer X sharing space with his family while remaining invisible to them. He attends Speed's races. At one point, he comes to the racer house with Inspector Detector, his first time home in decades, and there's a brief shot where he registers Spritle, and you see him realizing he has another sibling now, one he'll never get to know as a brother. Instead, he just has to bury his feelings and keep moving. Later, when Inspector Detector asks whether Rex made a mistake by hiding the truth from his family, his answer is simply,
If I did, it's a mistake I have to live with.
It's utterly heartbreaking, man. Like the kind of resignation that could only come from two filmmakers grappling with whether they will ever be able to emerge from the closet on their own terms and live public lives as their authentic selves. For Racer X, the answer is no, because doing so would risk undoing the growth his supposed death made possible for his family. In Rex's absence, Pops became a markedly better father. As endearing a character as Pops is, it's plainly obvious he wasn't all that good of a father to Rex. But it's clear that, while painful, the guilt and grief he feels over pushing Rex away is what has made him be a far better father to Speed. In being forced to confront the ways in which his actions as a father led his son to ruin, Pops grows.
I didn't lose Rex when he crashed. I lost him here. I let him think this stupid motor company meant more to me than he did. You'll never know how much I regret that mistake.
The same can be said for Mom, too. Just as Rex's death allowed him to become a more authentic version of himself, so too does it give the Racer family an opportunity to open up and become a more emotionally connected unit. So when Rex weighs whether to come back, he's not just weighing his own safety for his own desire to be known. He's weighing what his return would do to a family that has already grieved him, processed it, and rebuilt themselves around the meaning they made out of losing him. And so he makes the difficult choice to continue keeping those sides of his life separate. As far as trans allegories go, the idea that living your authentic life may come at the cost of maintaining a relationship with those you hold close is far from uplifting, but there's a sad yet all too common truth to it. For many trans people, this equation is their reality. But more strikingly, I think Rex's beautifully tragic fate speaks to the complicated feelings Lana and Lily more than likely had about transitioning when writing the film. When considering Lana's situation at the time, Racer X almost reads like wish fulfillment. He's a character with total agency over his transition, someone who gets to decide to maintain anonymity and compartmentalize their public and private lives after years of being forced to play a role. Conversely, you have Lily, whose gender identity was subject to far less speculation than her sister's at the time, yet had to watch helplessly while her sister was endlessly scrutinized for simply trying to affirm her gender identity in private. In becoming his true self, best self, Rex pushes his family further towards becoming their best selves too. His entire post-transition project is to make sure Speed can learn from his mistakes and live a better life than he did, which in hindsight is an especially touching story coming from a pair of trans sisters, the eldest of whom basically blazed a trail for her younger sister to follow. Like Rex, Speed's entire career to this point has also been an act of devotion. Speed spends the entire film racing in his brother's shadow, chasing his ghost, but stopping short of exceeding him, refusing to break his track record because he can't bring himself to overwrite the legacy of the person he lost. It's a gesture that is as beautiful as it is self-destructive, because doing so means Speed can't be true to himself. In this way, his inner journey throughout the film is coming to the realization that the way to honor Rex isn't by preserving him in amber, but by being true to himself. The crescendo of the final race, and really the whole film, is the moment Speed finally stops chasing the version of himself that exists in relation to his brother and starts being his authentic self, which is exactly what Rex as Racer X has been silently rooting for the entire time. If Speed Racer is a story about self-discovery for both brothers, then the crux of that revelation is learning to let go of Rex Racer. But maybe self-discovery is the wrong word for it, because the fact of the matter is that Rex and Speed never really have to discover themselves. They've always known who they are. They just haven't fully embraced it. In truth, Speed Racer is a story about knowing the truth about yourself from childhood, but struggling to self-actualize, and how finally doing so has the power to change the world for the better. At a time when Lana's most private truth was being ripped out of her hands by the tabloid press, the Wachowskis made a film where the most personal act possible is also the thing that tips the balance in a corrupted world. Lana came out to the world on her own terms 4 years after Speed Racer's release, and Lily came out 4 years after that. I can't know what role making this film played in either of those decisions, and I'd never presume to speculate on something so private. But the film is there. It exists. The Wachowskis made it, and what they made is a story about knowing yourself, being known, being loved through the knowing, and using all of it to help the next generation find themselves too. It's hard to imagine a more generous window into the journey they were actively navigating at the time. The allegory is about as on the nose as humanly possible. In any other movie, that level of didacticism might have easily felt clunky or even condescending, but in Speed Racer, it reads as honest, sincere even. For most of Speed Racer's runtime, the film seems as though Speed's destiny is inevitable. Throughout the back half of the second act, well into the early stretch of the third, a Rocky-style conclusion is repeatedly telegraphed. We've all seen these movies before. We know how this is going to go. But like everything else in this movie, the Wachowskis refuse to let cynical realism stand in for authenticity. For all their pessimism about the present, the Wachowskis are optimists at heart. The ending of Speed Racer is hopecore, before the world got so bad that we came up with a pithy name for movies with an optimistic outlook. Speed enters the Grand Prix ostensibly alone against a field of corporate-sponsored drivers with only his prowess for driving and the Mach 6, the only vehicle in the competition built with the human touch, and against all odds pulls off a win. The way this race unfolds is a testament to the unreality of this eventual outcome. The visual language of the film, which has already straddled the line between recognizable reality and hyper-stylization, goes into fucking overdrive and abandons all conventional filmmaking grammar. The whole thing plays like a single, unbroken stream of consciousness in which angles and compositions flow and meld seamlessly into one another. Speed's memories of Rex, of his father teaching him to drive, of his mother watching him from the stands bleed into the frame around him. We have been transported into Speed's head and we are watching him enter a flow state, where the physical mechanics of winning give way to the pure sensation of doing the thing he loves as well as he's ever done it. It's the visual run-on sentence the Wachowskis were chasing, the cinematic representation of how our brains experience a moment of total absorption, just continuous and abstract momentum, untethered from the constraints of time and space. By the time Speed does eventually cross that finish line, the fact that he's won the race doesn't even feel like the point anymore. On the surface, Speed not only winning the race, but toppling the tyrannical corporate interests that have plagued the sport he loves and vindicating his entire family is improbable. It's wish fulfillment. But when observed through the subjective point of view of Speed, that wish fulfillment is given the appropriate level of context to make it feel earned. In this way, the finale is as much a manifesto as it is the climax of a narrative, one which posits that the only limits on what we can achieve is our willpower to make it happen. But Speed is only able to do this because his passion for racing runs deeper than any affinity for the superficial aspects of the sport. Racing resonates with Speed because of what it represents. It's both a means to express himself as an individual and an extension of his relationship with his family. Because, again, subtext is for cowards, racing is central to how the racer family communicates with one another. It's how Pops expresses love. He builds cars. It's how Mom supports her kids, showing up at every track, no matter what. It's what bonds Speed and Rex. Racing isn't a job or a pastime in the racer house. It's the thing that binds them together, how they express who they are, and what gives their lives together meaning. As Speed himself puts it,
racing's in our blood. It isn't just a sport. It's way more important than that. It's like a religion.
Speed's use of the word religion here isn't hyperbole, it's kind of the only word that adequately describes what racing means to these people. And because of this, the racer family's quest to restore the purity of racing is far more than just an ideological dispute with the powers that be. It's a fucking crusade if there ever was one. A battle of the soul. And the reason their crusade isn't in vain is because those values are fundamental to racing's enduring appeal. Royalton and the other corporate interests who own the sport on paper can add as many bells and whistles as they like to racing in an effort to align it with their ideology, but at the end of the day, try as they might, they cannot make these things supplant the real reason people love racing. Because these qualities are intangible. The thrill of watching a contest of skill, endurance, and passion filled with remarkable feats of engineering and human ingenuity. The core appeal transcends anything capital can bring to the table. Think of runners who compete in marathons for no prize money, or your local athletes who actually spend money to enter competitions with no cameras, no sponsors, and no broadcast deal. In the absence of capital, people still show up. Speed doesn't drive for trophies or achievements or greatness, he drives for the love of it. And so, when Speed finally allows himself to beat his brother's time, he isn't just growing as a person, finally letting go of his brother, he's also growing as a racer, which is exactly what his brother had always wanted for him. A powerful undercurrent to all of this is the role parents play in instilling values into their children so that they will be empowered to make the right decisions on their own. Rex may have inspired Speed, but his parents guide him every step of the way. Mom doesn't just show up at the races, she's the one who sees Speed as an artist before anyone else does. For my money, the most important scene in the entire film isn't Royalton's monologue. I mean, it's probably my favorite dialogue scene in the film, but it's the conversation after Speed loses Fuji, where Mom tells him he couldn't have been more proud of him. Not because he won, but because he stood up. He wasn't afraid and he did what he thought was right. Instead of focusing on what Speed could learn from his loss, he uses the opportunity to zero in on something he likely wasn't thinking about, what he got right. Pops and Mom don't perfectly understand Speed, but they back him absolutely regardless. They are, essentially, the kind of parents every gay or trans child hopes for. I don't know much about the Wachowskis' parents, but to me, that doesn't read as a wish so much as it does a a thank you. And that's why Speed Racer has endured. Not because of the trippy visuals and experimental techniques, but because all of it is so clearly the result of refusing to compromise for anyone. Which is also why I love that the Wachowskis chose to do all of this within the confines of a family film. A film they hoped would, similar to the way The Matrix did for adults, challenge and inspire children to resist settling for the world as it is, to question the status quo and the way they are told things have to be, to resist becoming a cynical slave to capitalism. The Wachowskis dreamt of a hopeful, more optimistic world so that we, the kids who grew up with this film, could help realize it. That's a seriously beautiful thing to nestle inside a PG-rated adaptation of a then 40-year-old anime. Speed Racer really is The Matrix for kids. And unlike The Matrix, Speed Racer is generous enough to offer a decidedly more optimistic vision. You don't just take the red pill. You take the red pill and you still get to win the race. I don't know. I just think Speed Racer is a really cool movie that was ahead of its time. Experiencing the 4K restoration in IMAX was genuinely one of the trippiest, most exhilarating rides I've had in a theater ever. Maybe I might not have gotten it when I first saw that trailer at 13, but man, do I get it now. I admire it for its innovation and unabashed embrace of its source material. On top of that, it's just a really compelling story about family legacy and the people and relationships that inspire people to pursue their passions. In making this movie, the Wachowskis put their money where their mouth was and wagered that human creativity was more important than marketability. In 2008, they lost the bet, and it cost them a bit of prestige in the industry, but seeing audiences pack IMAX houses 18 years later to watch this film restored to the size and scale it has always deserved, I mean, you can't help but reconsider the outcome. The Wachowskis won the bet after all. It just took a little while for the times to catch up.